NILITH. Written by Sepia Wolf. It was a cold night. Cold for the season, but not particularly harsh for those that lived in the area. For someone raised in warmer climates, though, it would have been bone-chillingly bitter out. For this reason, no one really seemed to give a second thought to the woman that walked up to the desk of the inn and asked for a room. She was wrapped in a long coat that went all the way to her ankles, the fur-trimmed hood pulled up and drawn tight, muffling her voice as she spoke. The waver in her voice was that of someone who needed to warm their lungs before being able to properly speak. She was an exceptionally tall woman, and despite the coat, it was clear that she had a very elegant figure. "Is the one night for you, miss?" the innkeeper asked, hearing the teeth chatter inside the hood. He couldn't see her face as she nodded, her entire figure hunched, almost exaggerated to the people of the north. "That'll be 10 gold pieces. Where it's been stamped don't matter here." The woman merely nodded as she reached into a pocket, a hand clad in a black leather glove producing a pouch and setting it on the counter without a thought, and without counting the money inside. Slightly bemused, though very happy at what seemed like a very generous tip on top of the standard fee, he merely replaced the pouch with a key before putting it in the strongbox. "Quite gracious of you, miss." The innkeeper nodded politely, well aware that she now had the attention of the other sophisticated patrons of the establishment. "Will there be anything else I can get for you this evening? Or shall I take your bags up for you?" She glanced around, the direction of her hood facing the fireplace where nobles had set up a game of cards.
"No, thank you. I don't have much to carry. Is there anything in the way of entertainment scheduled for tonight?"
"Afraid not, miss. We don't schedule performances or anything like that here. The local nobles do host a table of cards and allow traveling lords to buy in if you're interested, though." The woman's voice seemed to show that she was quite happy to hear this.
"It's not a private game, then? Wonderful. Thank you very much for your time."
She lifted her light pack and gracefully swung it over her shoulder, taking her key and ascending the stairs to her room. All eyes watched her leave. The graceful sway in her hips was about all there was to see, though. Nothing but an all-black winter ensemble flowing with a practiced, delicate step. Those with money tended to be a bit eccentric, so as quickly as she was out of sight, she was forgotten. They had seen all types pass through, and a woman who seemed to think the autumn air was too cold wasn't all that remarkable. As the high-end establishment began preparing dinner services for those staying at her hearth for the evening, all eyes turned as they saw the new arrival make her return appearance. The clicks of footsteps on wood caught the first person's attention, making him glance up for a moment, only to do a double-take as he stared at the young woman elegantly making her way to the stairs from the upper level. His unbroken gaze and the confident stride brought more looks her way. The dress she was wearing swished like the long tails of fish in a decorative pond as she descended to the main level of the inn. Though it was gray, there was nothing drab about the exquisite garment. Gold embroidery separated sections into lighter shades with a regal design at her waist and up her trim middle to her chest. Jaws dropped as she crossed the communal area toward the fireplace. The stunning beauty of the slender woman was matched with a sweet, almost melodious voice as she placed a delicate hand on the back of an empty chair.
"Mind if I sit in, gentlemen?"
There was a stunned pause as every eye in the building bore down on the exotic beauty that had emerged from the room of the woman that checked in only an hour ago, before a man at the table uncomfortably cleared his throat. "Your kind's not welcome here." The young lady looked around as if suddenly aware that all had gone silent.
"Oh, I'm sorry. Do you prefer not to play with women?"
There were a few that had to try and stifle a chuckle at the partially masked innuendo behind the question. "You know what I mean." The man seemed to be purposely avoiding having to voice his thoughts out loud. "You're a sinner." The beauty before him chuckled.
A little ironic coming from a gambling man.
Her charm seemed unflappable as a few of the other men at the table found themselves nodding in agreement with her. In an attempt to stay at least somewhat classy, the man did not lash out, instead swallowing his discomfort and speaking plainly.
You know what I mean, girl. You're a hell child. A tiefling.
Despite the accusation, her plush, deep red lips parted in a beautiful smile. A smile made slightly unnerving by the sharp canines in her teeth. Her pure yellow eyes twinkled in the firelight. Despite all of her other features, these were not the most distracting of them. The magenta-hued skin was an unnatural contrast to any other living creature, and her long purple hair that hung to her waist and framed her delicate face were still barely strange. What were the long horns curving out from her head at the hairline, growing back and twisting slightly, just enough to point the tips toward the ceiling. A tail, almost as long as she was tall, flicked calmly, like it had a mind of its own, out of a custom-tailored portion of the dress. She had slid a few gold bangles and rings down its length for decoration, almost like she was proud of her lineage and not ashamed of it. The nails on her slender fingers seemed to grow to natural points, and her impish ears helped complete the devilish look. And even the clicking on the floor was not the sound of classy high-heeled shoes, but of cloven hooves. As beautiful as she was always going to be regarded with disdain for these looks. The tieflings were the descendants of those long ago who had made a pact with the devils. Forever marked by this sin, the more heinous the pact, the more their future children looked like the creatures they had sold their souls to. The only thing missing from the mystery woman at the table was a set of leathery wings sprouting from her back, making her ancestry one of the darkest known to the modern world. Yet, she continued to smile, and even bowed politely.
I understand. Really, though, I only asked a polite question. A simple no thank you would have sufficed.
The men at the table looked at each other, some showing guilt on their faces. The oldest noble at the table seemed to be the least concerned with our unexpected guest, and pursed his lips under the salt and pepper walrus mustache hiding his mouth.
It's a 300 gold piece buy-in for this game, young lady. If you have the coin, I don't see why you can't join in.
A hand moved to her chest, and none could deny that they expected her to pull a coin purse from the cleavage of her bosom, but instead it rested near her collarbone, just under a gold necklace in a gesture of heartfelt gratitude.
Thank you! I love cards. It's been a long time since I've gotten to play.
She produced a coin pouch in her palm that she had hidden behind her back, and handed it to the dealer.
This should cover it.
The men eyed each other again. This was the second time she had taken out money and hadn't even bothered to count it out. She also had a naive tone to her voice, and as if to confirm it, she had already openly admitted to not having played much recently. The dealer gave her a pile of chips and dealt the first hand of the night.
So tell me, what is it you've chosen to call yourself?
The elderly gentleman that had invited her to play asked. The girl seemed surprised. It was common for a tiefling to be discarded at a very young age, making it rare for the already few to make it to adulthood. On the other hand, for such a wealthy young woman, most had always assumed that her parents had raised her despite the judging eyes of society.
My name is NILITH.
Just NILITH? The man raised an eyebrow, showing that he had guessed, rather than known, her situation.
I'm afraid so.
Her smile still seemed to brighten the room.
One day there may be a surname after it, but not yet.
A wistful sigh and a dreamy gaze upward had a few of the nobles nudging each other, as though they had hit the jackpot. Nilith's face, despite her eyes being void of any marks or color besides the gleaming yellow, was incredibly expressive. Her tail flicked eagerly at the thought of marriage, too. A creature that should have had a perfect poker face was looking like the easiest read they had ever seen.
I'm Baron Walson of Dugaford.
The walrus mustache fanned out a little, making it look like the thick brush itself was smiling.
It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance.
The pleasure is mine, NILITH beamed back, shaking his hand before the game went underway. It was an easy game for most at the table. It seemed almost too easy to tell what the tiefling was up to. Every time she had a good hand, her tail swished back and forth, nearly tripping a waitress that came to serve them drinks a few times. She would end up with barely more than the NT price added to her pile, and no one would be out all that much money. When she was bluffing, that all-telling tail would twitch and almost fidget beneath the chair, as though the very act of lying was stressing the young girl out. Because of this and her inability to take risks, it seemed she usually ended up folding before raising too much on her hand. Because of this, she seemed to be stuck at her buy-in amount, and perhaps losing a few gold here and there. One by one, the men at the table either had to turn in for the night or lost their money to the others, leaving NILITH, Baron Walson, and one other man at the table. Of the 300 gold NILITH had started with, she only had 200 left, while the other two had nearly tripled their money. Even still, she was smiling the whole time, seeming to be having a good time being in their company, and what was starting to look like a few drinks too many.
I think I'm going to leave this last hand down to you two.
The Baron yawned.
I'm too old to be up this late, but I want to see how this goes. You've lasted surprisingly long for how you play, NILITH.
NILITH broke out into a giddy laugh, not quite slurring her words, but once she found the bottom of her glass, there was no doubt she would be. You're just afraid you're gonna lose all your money to me.
These tired eyes can't look at another hand, but I'll gladly see how this plays out between you and Lord Dewberry.
Baron Walson chuckled. NILITH giggled and looked at her last hand, selecting 3 of the 5 cards and exchanging them for new ones. The young lord across from her smirked and exchanged 2 of his own before they started bidding. While NILITH giggled every time she played with her chips and threw more into the center of the table, Lord Dewberry wondered if her face somehow could have possibly looked redder, watching her drain the rest of her wine from the glass as she rocked in her chair. He had a great hand, and the girl seemed to be throwing around her money just for the sake of the clink it made when it hit the pile. He had this, he thought to himself. There was no way she was even really playing anymore. Apparently too drunk to even be paying attention to her cards. He hadn't even seen her look at the 3 new cards she'd gotten from the dealer. NILITH seemed to be getting bored with throwing a few chips in at a time, and slid the rest of her pile to the center of the table. I'ma go all in. She slouched in her chair, propping up her face with her free hand and smiling across the table with bleary eyes. Lord Dewberry chuckled at the easy win, and without thinking slid his entire, much larger pile into the center of the table too. It was just as he pulled his hands away that he realized her tail hadn't been twitching or wagging the entire hand. He had a sudden sense of dread as he sat back, considering everything before shaking his head clear. The girl was drunk, clearly not playing the game anymore, he assured himself.
All in,
he said, still not sure if he should have only matched her bet.
Show your cards,
the dealer said calmly. Dewberry threw down his cards on the table.
Full house.
NILITH's face slipped off her palm, nearly smacking into the table, as she sat bolt upright, pretending she hadn't almost fallen asleep. She laid out her cards slowly, giggling as she did.
Full queens and a king,
the dealer announced for her. He's a lucky king, NILITH giggled to herself, and his queens have happy faces.
NILITH wins,
the dealer said, just as surprised as everyone else at the table. Dewberry was at a loss for words. Confused and dejected, he had to admit to himself that he'd only lost 300 of his own gold, and that was easily replaced. With that in mind, he shrugged and placed it all on bad luck and thoughtlessness on his part. He graciously shook Nilith's hand, her arm flopping heavily, before taking his leave.
Good show, Nilith.
Baron Walson patted the inebriated tiefling on the back heartily.
Dealer, please convert her winnings and place them in a pouch. I'll show her to her room.
Yes, Baron, right away. The dealer bowed. Once the money was placed in the pouch, Walson looped it around her belt and helped her to her feet, her hooves clopping like a tap dancer's shoes until she found her footing. One arm around her waist and putting one of hers over his shoulder, he walked Nilith up the stairs and to her door.
You are so sweet.
Nilith, amazingly, still wasn't slurring her speech.
I bet you've got a Mrs. Baroness out there, don't you?
Oh, yes, for 30-some years now.
He chuckled, finding her key and fumbling to open the door while trying to hold her up.
Well, then why are you being so nice to me?
Nilith asked, yawning as she stumbled into her room. The Baron was quiet for a moment.
I know what it's like to carry the burden of the sins of the father. At least people can't look at me and know them, though. I hope you do find someone to give you a surname someday.
Nilith smiled as she sighed, closing the door almost all the way before whispering a sober,
Thank you.
The following morning, Nilith was already gone. Her key had been left on the counter of the inn's reception desk long before the keeper had awoken. Baron Walson sighed in disappointment, hoping to have caught her for breakfast. She was such a colorful character that it would have been a shame not to have a story to bring back to tell his wife. He sat in his spot near the fireplace, the deck of cards still on the table. In the light, he noticed something in the glare of the glossy back. A thin crease, like someone had dug their fingernail into the card. It was odd, because as a custom, a new deck was brought out for every new game where money was involved. Out of curiosity, he flipped through a few more cards, finding a similar mark on each one. Not only that, but none of them were in the same place, each and every one scarred in a different way. An angry shout, most definitely uncommon in such a refined establishment, cut across the room, and Baron Walson looked and saw a furious innkeeper pounding a fist on his counter.
Where is she, that little charlatan?
Calm down, my good man. What's wrong? The Baron asked.
I was counting the till and found this.
The innkeeper dumped out a distinctive coin purse very similar to the one Nilith had used to buy her chips the previous night, and fumed at the contents that poured out. Baron Walson had to stifle a chuckle as a few gold tumbled out first, obviously on top of the pile inside, but afterward was followed by copper pieces and even a few mismatched buttons rolling across the polished wooden surface. Wondering if the tiefling had pulled the same trick to get in on the card game, he was glad that his mustache hid the smile underneath fairly well. It looked like he had a story to tell his wife after all.